This podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Washington Wise is an original podcast from Charles Schwab that unpacks the stories making news in Washington right now and how they may affect your finances and portfolio. Listen at schwab.com/WashingtonWise. There's so much to get worked up about these days that I'd forgive you for not noticing a news item that completely bummed me out a couple weeks back. The news was about layoffs at Sesame Workshop. And I get it. I'm a softie, a parent, a person of a certain age. But still, I heard all this and I thought, really?
Yeah, I had the exact same reaction. Like, what kind of world are we living in where, Sesame Street, Sesame Workshop has to lay off people and there isn't some person charging in on a white steed to save the day?
David Kamp is not an unbiased person to call with this news. He wrote a book about Sesame Street called Sunny Days, the children's television revolution that changed America.
But I could also say, Mary, that I was part of generation one of the show's viewership. I was sat down by my mom, who'd read about this amazing new educational program that PBS was putting out. And so, yeah, I mean, both as a user and as a historian, I am deeply embedded in the world of Sesame Street.
Do we know yet how many people are going to be let go?
I've seen numbers, between 150 and 200.
Oh my gosh, that seems like a lot.
It does.
The problems for Sesame Street run deep. Back in December, they announced a split with their distributor and benefactor, HBO. HBO is now owned by Warner Brothers. How much financial trouble do you think Sesame Street's in?
I don't know that financial trouble is the right term. It's more a matter of who is going to take care of Sesame Street. I have to imagine someone is going to recognize it as the valuable media property and American institution that it is.
It's weird to me to think about Sesame Street and Sesame Workshop having to prove its value because its value is so embedded in everyday life. Like, I have this clear memory of having bath time with one of my kids when they were little, and we had those little shapes you would stick up on the bathtub wall, and they made a shape that was like a rectangle with a half circle on top of it and said "Sesame, Sesame." And I was like, what are you talking about? Until I realized it was the shape of the Sesame Street sign, like the brand.
Yeah, and that's actually a wonderful lesson in how persuasive the show is, because Sesame Street isn't just a show where they write something, they film it, and then they put it on TV. One of their curricular goals every year is teaching kids shapes. So the fact that your kids can configure those shapes to make them be the Sesame Street logo, that shows how successful they are and what distinguishes them from any other children's programming.
I guess what I'm asking is, how can something so ubiquitous, so baked into American childhood, be at financial risk? Like, why is it having to prove itself?
Well, there's two main things. One is simply we used to live in a monoculture where everyone watched the same 3 or 4 networks and listened to the same AM radio. And that was at the time Sesame Street was founded. We live in a different era now where you said it was baked in, Mary, to our world, but it's not as baked in as it used to be.
Is the fact that Sesame Street is facing some financial risk right now a sign of the times?
Absolutely, it's a sign of the times, because one thing you have to look at in the context in which Sesame Street arose in the late 60s is the diametric opposite of the social context we live in now. It wasn't seen as controversial or, and I'm using air quotes here, woke. It was just seen as good. Like, what could be better than using the power of TV to educate kids before they even get into kindergarten?
Today on the show, the trouble at Sesame Street. It turns out it can teach you a whole lot about our country's changing priorities. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's smart to always have a few financial goals. And here's a really smart one you can set: earning cash back on what you buy every day. With Discover, you can. Get this. Discover automatically matches all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year. Seriously, all of it. Discover trusts you to make smart decisions. After all, you listen to this podcast. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
Your data is like gold to hackers. They're selling your passwords, bank details, and private messages. McAfee helps stop them. Secure VPN keeps your online activity private. AI-powered text scam detector spots phishing attempts instantly. And with award-winning antivirus, you get top-tier hacker protection. Plus, you'll get up to $2 million in identity theft coverage, all for just $39.99 for your first year. Visit McAfee.com. Cancel anytime. Terms apply.
It might be good to lay out like what children's programming looked like before Sesame Street. I was reading a little bit about the origin of Sesame Street, and the writer pointed out that there was this pitch reel that had been made for the program where like the Muppets are sitting around like, what are we going to call this show? And one of the Muppets is like,
these kids can't read or write, can they?
No.
Then how's about we call the show Hey Stupid?
it was like a joke about how children's programming at the time was goofy, but also condescending to kids. And the mission of Sesame Street was not to be like that.
Yes, absolutely. And Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets, who got involved pretty early on in the development of the show, he was someone who had worked a lot in commercial TV and indeed in making commercials, and kind of felt there's got to be something higher to this. There's got to be a better use. TV, people forget that TV was the internet. You know, what we think of TikTok now is like with both fascination and alarm. Oh, what's it doing to our brains? What's it doing to our children's brains? That was TV in the 60s. It was growing rapidly. More and more people had TV sets in their houses. It was this increasingly dominant medium that was a little scary to people. And especially parents were concerned because what children's TV had been on, some of it was, benign but not educational, like Saturday morning cartoons. But some of it, like the children's TV of the 50s, if you look it up on YouTube now, like Pinky Lee or the Howdy Doody Show, it's kind of scary to me. It's kind of assaultive. It's these guys, these like old vaudevillian guys going like, I'm coming at you, kids. Wah! And it's kind of like very, very assaultive and noisy and kind of scary looking puppets and scary looking men, to be honest. And it was kind of condescending to children.
How was Sesame Street created in the first place?
Well, two people, Joan Gans Cooney and Lloyd Morissette, became friends, and they began casually discussing this idea at a dinner party. Joan Gans Cooney was someone who was making anti-poverty documentaries for public television. Lloyd Morissette was an executive with the philanthropic Carnegie Corporation who was really interested in early childhood development. And so it was one of those things where their two missions came together. He was trying to see, could TV be used to help kids at risk who, just need better preparation for school? And Joan Gans Cooney was saying, how can I use TV to help anti-poverty efforts? Her original goal for Sesame Street wasn't to reach all preschool kids. She was specifically trying to help. She said the bullseye of our program is disadvantaged inner city 4-year-olds. And she was even more specifically talking about Black and Puerto Rican kids in New York circa 67, 68, 69. And so Sesame Street was initially developed, as a mission to do good, to harness the power of television for good, at the earliest level of life, early childhood.
Yeah, Sesame Street premiered in 1969.
Yes.
What was the political landscape? Like what made this show possible at that moment in time?
Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, was kind of an extension of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy's, New Frontier. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country, which meant that adults had a sort of moral mission to sort of help everyone out and look after the future generation. There was just a belief in the common good, and it wasn't seen as controversial. 50 states of buy-in. And by the way, while they were developing Sesame Street, they went from the Johnson administration to the Nixon administration. And here's what's so crazy about this in retrospect is a few nights before Sesame Street premiered in November 1969, Nixon's commissioner of education, a guy named Dr. James Allen, goes on NBC for a half-hour special to say,
and I hope you will help your child find this exciting new way to learning by tuning to your local educational station each day at Sesame Street time. Thank you.
It's just unfathomable that, but half of the funding for the startup costs of Sesame Street came from the Department of Education. So the federal government was literally invested in it. And again, it wasn't seen as controversial. It was seen as, oh, what a good use of federal dollars.
How did the creators of Sesame Street make sure the show worked? Because the idea was we're going to educate kids, but how do you even measure that?
Well, through rigorous preparation, because that show was in the works for 3 years before episode 1 aired. And it wasn't just, let's hire Jim Henson and some actors and some songwriters, although those were all huge, consequential choices. It was also, let's convene panels of educators, of juvenile psychologists, and of experts from various fields. And let's not only do that, but let's do some test segments and see how well they play to kids. Like they actually had a guy named Ed Palmer, director of research, who had a device called a distractor, which meant while the kids were watching TV and watching these test clips of Sesame Street, he had another screen perpendicular to it where they would flash slides of whatever, photos and images and animals, and to see how easily kids were distracted. One thing they learned, for example, is that the live action segments on the street set, where it was just human beings, would bore kids. The kids would get distracted because until that moment, the Muppet segments had been segregated from the live action ones. And that was when the light bulb went off of, oh, let's integrate the Muppets into those street scenes so the human beings and the Muppets interact, because that held the kids' attention better.
In the early days, was the show actually reaching its target audience of low-income Black and brown kids?
In the early days, Sesame Street was tremendously successful. And in fact, there was a great affirmation of how successful it was, that teachers in the inner city schools said they noticed a palpable difference in kids entering kindergarten and already having a facility for numbers and being familiar with letters. And what's amazing about that too is in 69 and 70, a lot of poor houses still didn't even have TVs. So another thing that the Children's Television Workshop, as Sesame Workshop used to be called, one thing they did that was also awesome was they had community centers. They actually had a whole social component where they coordinated with community leaders in the projects to say, let's have a TV in a common viewing room so kids can watch Sesame Street, with their parents or caregivers. So even if you don't have a TV in your apartment, you can still watch the show. And everyone loved it. I mean, there was not a ton of pushback against it. It was pretty successful right out of the gate.
We're talking today because of funding streams for Sesame Street and what's going on with them. So I feel like I'd be remiss in not asking how federal funding for Sesame Street and public media generally changed after the show came into being. Originally it's paying for half of the costs, something like that. But what happened during the Reagan years?
There was never a long-term plan for Sesame Street to be dependent on federal largesse. And so it just seemed like it was always going to be a kind of thing where you would taper off the amount of federal money, but there was still some. And also the very idea that it existed on public television meant that there had to be some governmental buy-in to the concept of Sesame Street's point of existing even. In the Reagan era, the new chairman of the FCC his name was Mark Fowler, and he had a very different line on the responsibility of television versus his predecessors. He referred to a TV set famously as a toaster with pictures, meaning it was just another consumer appliance. And he thought it was weird that we would ascribe any kind of moral imperative to it. Like, why should we think that TV needs to have federal oversight or federal regulation? It's just another appliance. So he was saying, who cares about the public interests? TV has no obligation to serve the quote unquote public interest. So in the Reagan era, you saw a retrenchment from this idea of federal support of educational TV.
So let's talk about how Sesame Street adapted to survive, I guess, in the deregulatory era. I see part of the way Sesame Street adapted, for a bunch of reasons, as embodied by one character, which is Elmo.
Mm-hmm. The 4-letter word, yes.
Yeah, the 4-letter word. You're implying there's some controversy with Elmo.
Well, Elmo came along in the 90s, and Elmo was more of a proxy for a 2 or 3-year-old, which was a sign of the times that simply, it was a weird idea in the 60s and 70s that 2 and 3-year-olds would even watch TV. But by the 90s, it was normal that, TV is so ubiquitous that kids start watching, let's face it, pretty much in the cradle. Parents are putting TV on in some form. And, it's never been truer than now with iPads and iPhones. But in the 90s, the median age of the Sesame Street viewer went down. And so Sesame Workshop had to respond. And so they kind of made a show within the show called Elmo's World, which is way more, I'm going to say, peewee, little kid, cutesy than the other programming within Sesame Street.
I mean, I can sing the song. La, 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 la. I could do it right now.
Wow. And Mary, you should be in music. I don't know why you're doing this job. But the fact that you can so easily mimic Elmo is the point, that Elmo has a stickiness and a simplicity. And I guess the whole idea is that there's still something educational about Elmo's World. I mean, again, it's very sweet. It's about babies and goldfish and positive stimuli. But it was way more cutesy poo, which is the phrase that Sonia Manzano, who played Maria on Sesame Street, said. But that was just kind of a bending to the market.
Can Sesame Street survive streaming? That is coming up after a break.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities. So do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Pro Savings Days are back at Lowe's with limited time savings on the supplies pros need. Get up to 40% off select major appliances. Plus, save an additional $100 on every $1,000 you spend on select major appliances. And don't miss your chance to activate and earn 3 times the points on select DeWalt and Klein tools. Lowe's, we help, you save. Valid through 3/28. Selection varies by location. While supplies last. See associate or Lowe's.com for more details on qualifying items.
Was there a moment when the popularity of Elmo stopped working for the show? Like, it became clear there would need to be some other financial resource that would keep Sesame Workshop going?
Well, the idea of, this is mind-blowing to discuss, 130 hour-long episodes a year, because that's what Sesame Workshop was producing up until the 90s. That's a ton of programming, 130 new episodes a year, each 1 hour.
I mean, that would make a YouTuber blush.
Yeah. That just could not be sustained. I mean, the only way that could be sustained is if, some benign billionaire or some benign governmental agency agreed to underwrite it. So it just became a kind of thing where, like, okay, we have to exist, that Sesame Street can no longer exist at the scale it once did, especially in this atomized media market. So latter-day Sesame Street has been about 30 odd episodes a year, 30 minutes a piece. So the scale of it's way back. And for a while, that was made possible by HBO, because HBO, in what was then a controversial move, they bought the rights to underwrite the show in 2015. And the really controversial part was that the new shows would air for a 9-month period exclusively on HBO or HBO Max. And then they would be bumped over to free streaming and programming on PBS. And that was seen as, hang on, this show is established for kids, and now its new episodes are on a premium channel and premium streaming service. That didn't feel right to a lot of people. I defend it because, look, if they were going to underwrite new episodes and new programming of Sesame Street, if that's the way it's going to get done, that's the way.
So for decades, Sesame Workshop was kind of hopping from patron to patron. Started with the federal government, public media, then HBO. How did this production unit become patronless this year?
I guess that David Zaslav, who is the head of Warner Brothers Discovery, he's kind of trying to reshape his company. And, one of the assets that he acquired when he took over the company was HBO. And within HBO, now called Max, the library of Sesame Street and the ability to create new Sesame Street programming. And I don't know the rationale for it, but he decided this isn't part of our future.
It's interesting because as the financing of Sesame Workshop became a little more perilous, you could see the workers inside the organization trying to keep their footing. Like the writers inside have been Writers Guild for a while, but then just in the last few weeks, some other employees said they were interested in unionizing. And it was within a day of that announcement that all of a sudden we were hearing about layoffs. It's hard to imagine those things are unrelated, but it certainly speaks to people inside perceiving real risk at this moment for their work.
Yeah, I mean, like all legacy media, Sesame Street is in an existential crisis, and I think that they are going to survive in some form, and I dare say a more thriving form than other legacy media. Like, there was a time when magazines like Time Magazine and Sports Illustrated were huge, and now they're shells of their former selves. Sesame Street won't be a shell of its former self, but if you're a worker there, you say, like, this legacy institution that I started working for 20 years ago or even 10 years ago is not on as sure a footing as it used to be.
There's this case that people who are fans of inclusivity make all the time about inclusiveness, that it benefits everyone in the end. Like making the world more accessible for the few makes it better for the many. And I think about that a lot when I think about Sesame Street, which of course was created to reach young, poor kids, but then became this beloved thing for all kinds of children. People often talk about this with things like curb cuts. Like curb cuts made the world more accessible for people with wheelchairs, but then also people with strollers, people with suitcases, people on bikes, all kinds of people. I feel like Sesame Street is just the ultimate proof of that point of view. Like it was created for this one group, it benefited everyone, and now for some reason it seems a little adrift. It's just really sad to me.
Yeah, I mean, it was created in an environment of, if we uplift the least fortunate among us, we uplift all of us. which is a really wonderful and noble sentiment. And it's not woke and it's not PC. It's a belief in the common good. And that's the phrase that I keep returning to, the common good. We've kind of drifted from that concept a little. And I think Sesame Street embodied that, that sunny day sweeping the clouds away. And, it was this kind of aspirational land that you saw a bunch of kids running to in the opening credits. And that's the beauty of it. And I think that's childhood too, childhood is before, you realize that you're necessarily different from other people or that there are people who won't like you. And so it's this idealized world that they did such a good job of creating, and it really should persist. And it's on us to help it persist.
You're so optimistic. I can hear it in your voice and in your answers to these questions. You've said a bunch of times that you are convinced Sesame Street is sticking around and will be here for generations to come. But what do you think it's going to look like on the other side of all of these big changes?
I think part of the way to answer that question is to look at what they're doing internationally, because Sesame Street is way less controversial around the globe than it is in this country, because it's so appreciated for what it does. And one thing that Sesame Workshop is doing is adapting itself and reconfiguring itself for whatever circumstances exist in any given place. So if you're in a Syrian refugee camp, they have Sesame Street via WhatsApp, even if it's like these little tiny videos that parents can play to kids, in these straitened circumstances. But at the same time, it can just be a language other than English. And the Muppets are a little different because, they represent the culture of the particular location where that iteration of Sesame Street is being created. The point is, it's a very adaptable idea that appeals to the best of human nature and the best of what's good for kids.
But what you're laying out is a Sesame Street that has to compete with brain rot. Like, it has to essentially be somehow more delicious and nutritious than Baby Shark.
Yeah, so?
You think they got the juice? You think they can do it?
I think that there's such a back catalog of awesome material that if you could almost like duplicate it. You could just keep doing updated versions of It's Not Easy Being Green and put down the Ducky. People who didn't grow up watching Sesame Street 5 days a week like me still know who Ernie and Bert are. They still know who Cookie Monster is. They still know who Elmo is. They still know who Big Bird is. They still know who Oscar the Grouch is. And they still know these songs that have been now, some of them have been bopping around for 50 years now. There's a huge cultural motherlode of stuff that Sesame Street has created that's kind of, embedded in our DNA now. You could just keep using the cultural capital and the goodwill that there still is for Sesame Street. And I think that, I can't say I'm optimistic that it'll ever be as big as it once was, because nothing's as big as it once was. But I do think that Sesame Street has a role to play in the future of American children.
David Kamp, thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm grateful for your time.
And I'm so pleased to be here. Thank you.
David Kamp is the author of Sunny Days, the children's television revolution that changed America. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Anna Phillips, Ethan Oberman, and Madeline Ducharme. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. Go track me down on Blue Sky. Say, hey, I'm at Mary Harris. And thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here next time.